So this film was born out of a few things. Number one, it follows my last film, Lobster War, and when that film was part of, this is arguably the capstone of a trilogy of films about how climate change is affecting our regional ecosystem, specifically our ocean, the Gulf of Maine here off New England. And the first one, called Sacred Cod, was about how climate change has arguably fueled the collapse of our iconic cod species. And Lobster War was about how climate change was exacerbating tensions between the United States and Canada over this small rock that both countries have claimed since the end of the Revolutionary War. That rock, called Machias Seal Island, was not anything anybody really cared about. It was the waters around them that also were not very interesting to a lot of people until the last decade or so, when the warming waters around that island suddenly made them abundant with lobster, because the waters reached this sweet spot. And as a result of that, there was a huge surge in the lobster catch. And all of a sudden, the Canadians, who long ceded the waters to the Americans, decided they wanted to fish those waters too. And that created all kinds of conflict, thus Lobster War. And while making that film, I learned a lot about how lobster lines, specifically vertical buoy lines, which is what the subject of this film is really about, were affecting one of the world's most endangered species, the North Atlantic right whale. And after spending all of that time on the last film, with a lot of that time in Maine, I thought it would be interesting and compelling to look at this issue. And also, I would add that around the time that I was sort of finishing the last film and sort of contemplating this film, the United Nations released this really astonishing report that suggested that 1 million species are likely to go extinct by the end of this century. And that figure, to me, was astonishing, hard to fathom. And I started to think, how do you tell the story about such a large, unfathomable number? And I thought the best way to do that would be to tell the story through one species, one that a lot of people can empathize with or identify with, a whale. And I've been writing a lot about the plight of the right whale for the Globe, as I work as an environment reporter in my day job. And right around that time, as you know well, Mackenzie, there was this regulatory process that started where the federal government, the federal agency responsible for overseeing protected or endangered species, as well as promoting thriving fisheries, suddenly was being asked to thread the needle and increase protections for the whales that were increasingly becoming more at risk. And I can go on to that afterward, but that's a long answer to your short question.
Thank you so much. I think that definitely gives everybody a lot of background while also bringing in some of your previous documentaries. With that, we are going to share my screen and play the trailer.
Right whale is an extraordinary creature. It's really one of the wonders of the living world. But if something in our management doesn't change, the direction of the population points to zero. and that's extinction.
The North Atlantic right whale is considered one of the most endangered species on the planet.
This would be the first large whale in modern history that would go extinct.
% of the right whale population now bears scars that indicate entanglement injury. This was a big problem, and it's an urgent problem.
It's a tragedy that we're losing the right whale. It's emblematic of large-scale changes that are happening on the planet.
Human beings can exist without biodiversity, and this is maybe a harbinger of where we're going.
We need to put as much pressure as we can on the agency to step up and take action right now.
I don't think the urgency can be overstated. Human action is killing these whales, and human action has the ability to save them.
Lobstermen are stewards of the sea, and they don't want to entangle anything.
I sit here and listen to environmentalist after environmentalist tell me what a murderous individual I am.
My opinion about the whales is fuck them. What more can we do? Eventually, they're going to die off. It's going to happen no matter what.
Then means lobster industry will face of this absurd federal overreach.
The challenge is to find ways for the fishing industry and the right whales to coexist in the same waters.
Noah is the fox got in the chicken coop. You're going to be fired for being a liar and a person who works to kill off the right whale.
One of the problems is that fisheries are one of the main factors that are endangering protected species. You end up with one organisation deeply conflicted with its mission.
Okay, so now that everybody is on the same page, I guess, David, start us off with kind of what was your development process and how did this process kind of vary from your previous documentaries?
Well, the first thing I want to say is that I hope everybody watches that outside of Zoom, because the audio I show you is a little bit better than what you just heard. So a little less choppy outside Zoom. But what was my development process? Meaning, how did I start the film? What did I, how did I go about making this film, essentially?
Yeah, I guess kind of how, from Sacred Cod and Lobster Wars, how did you kind of come to the idea of wanting to follow the North Atlantic right whale? And then what was the process from the idea of, with that animal, going through funding and kind of developing this idea into a larger project?
Yeah. So after I just sketched out how I sort of came to this idea about this film, and the first step actually was trying to get a permit to film the whales. And with endangered species like right whales, you require federal approval to actually shoot them. And so early on in the process, actually, this was kind of the linchpin for me to decide to start shooting. We got through the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, which is one of the outfits that does a lot of research on right whales. We were able to get a permit through one of their oceanographers through the federal government to fly drones over the whales. We also sought a permit, unsuccessfully actually, to go diving with the whales so we could shoot underwater. And we were planning to work with this amazing National Geographic underwater videographer. Unfortunately, though, we were not able to get a permit to do that because it's a violation of the law, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, which is sort of a subsection of the Endangered Species Act, doesn't allow doesn't allow people to get that close to the whales. So we couldn't do that. So the first shot, which you saw in a choppy fashion in the trailer, which is also the opening of the film, we were able to acquire that footage from a Canadian researcher who was able to jump in the water and got lucky to get that amazing shot. It was actually a 360 camera. So it was the sort of thing where you can like manipulate the image with your mouse and you can sort of look around. And so we were able to convert that into a two-dimensional image, if that's how you describe it. But once we got that permit, I think the first shoot was on a sailboat with the oceanographers from the Woods Hole Institution, and they study the whales, flying drones over them. Actually, what they do is they fly drones over the spouting, the water spouts of the whales, and they take samples to sort of figure out how healthy and what the inner state is of the whales. But once I spent a day doing that, and that was a sort of test in a sense for me to see, what kind of footage we were able to get of the whales, and see, to deepen my sense of the story. From there, I found you and Julia Campos and some other folks to help do sound and to help as second cameras. And in short, because of my experience with other films and because of a partner I work with, Andy Laub, who is a graduate of Emerson. And actually, I don't know if you know this story, but I used to teach at Emerson, and Andy Laub was a student of mine. And so I had no idea about his editing skills or his cinematography skills until years later, after the marathon bombings. And I had the unfortunate luck of being on the center of the finish line, waiting to finish what was going to be my first short film for a class I was taking while on leave from my job at the Globe, when all of a sudden the two bombs went off, and I was still learning how to use a video camera when all of a sudden I basically had to film the entire aftermath of the bombings. And after filming that and starting to after filming that, I ended up meeting this woman and writing a story about this woman for the paper who had just run 25 miles and leapt over the barricades after being stopped by police and ran to help all of these people because she was a pediatric doctor. And she ended up tying tourniquets and doing all this amazing work and became a hero. And I wrote a story about her for the paper, and we kept in touch. And not long after that, she was telling me how she met this guy, Andy Laub, who saw my story about her and then ended up working with a production company to make a short film about her. And we all had dinner, and she made the connection that he was a former student of mine. And then, it was very nice because the teacher sort of became the student because he was so much far further along as a filmmaker than I was. And he taught me so much, and we decided to make a follow-up to that short, which was like a 20-minute short that I made when I was on leave doing this thing called the Nieman Fellowship for journalists at Harvard, where you have this, which is like Nirvana for journalists, where you get to spend a year studying whatever you want at Harvard. And I was taking a documentary film class, and I made this 19-minute film. But of course, it had this horrific ending that was not what I was expecting. It was about the first little person to run the Boston Marathon. And I'd spent several months shooting her and was there on the finish line expecting that she was, that this was going to be the triumphant end of the film. And to make a long story even longer, I ended up spending the year continuing to film with her as Andy helped, and I ended up running the marathon with her, shooting the whole way. Andy actually ran as well, and he nearly passed out because he was carrying like a heavier DSLR the whole way. And then we cut the film together, and that was our first. We cut a feature film, and that was our first film. And so Andy and I have worked on the last four films after that together. And so the short of the long is that because of our experience making films, we sort of had what we need to and knew what we needed to do to make the film. And so the first order of business after we had enough footage was to make a sizzle. And we used that sizzle, which was, I don't know, 4 or 5 minutes, might have been shorter, to apply for grants. And I can keep going, but feel free to shut me off. I can.
Well, that kind of goes into one of the
Okay.
questions that someone was asking, which is, what is the process like to find funding for these projects?
Right. So it's haphazard. It's not easy, and a lot of luck is involved sometimes. I think it gets a little easier the more experience you have. So when you have a bit of a track record, and you've worked with funders and people get to know your work, it makes it a little easier to get funding. But with this film, our first grant came from the Pulitzer Center. And when I say luck, I knew the executive editor at the Pulitzer Center who was overseeing these grants, and she was a former colleague of mine at the Globe, and she was a former Neiman Fellow, and we had been talking about filmmaking. And so when I heard about the grant, I sort of had an in to that grant in a way that might have been harder for other people. And that started us out. And then we got another grant from this outfit called the Left Foundation, which is a big sponsor of New England filmmakers. And we'd actually sought grants from in the past without success, but they were familiar with our work. And then the Pulitzer Center connected us with this other funder who actually provided the principal support for making the film until bailing out the day the shutdown started when the pandemic hit. But by then we pretty much were on our way. So that's kind of how it worked.
And how long did the process of start to finish, being the idea through pre-production, through production, into post-production, how long did that take?
It was about a year. So I think we started shooting in April, April 2019. So, we completed filming. I think our last shoot was off the coast of Georgia in late February, actually just before the pandemic hit. And we started editing, I think in October. I think we cut the sizzle soon after, probably like last spring or in May or June of 2019. You might remember better than I do because I think I showed it to you around that time, just after we made it. And then we started editing probably in earnest in December, and then completed a rough cut on I think like March 16th, the day before the shutdown. And we at that point were working with, we had a green light from a broadcaster, a national broadcaster, and then they pulled out right after the pandemic hit, along with our primary funder. So it hit us like a ton of bricks, but we kept going. And after the initial rough cut, I think our final cut, and I use that word final in some respects in air quotes, because there have been numerous developments in the last few weeks alone, one of which I reported on in the paper yesterday. The right whale population, which was estimated to be at around 400, the latest estimate is now 356, which is a substantial decline and catastrophic for the species, and a few other developments. And so we'll probably update the film again as we move toward a broadcaster, and I could talk about that in a little bit more in a bit.
Yeah, so going kind of into the synopsis of the film and some of the content a little bit more, obviously there were these two very different sides, you know, the side of the lobstermen who were just trying to not hurt the whales and just make the money that they needed to survive, and then the right whale activists who are trying their best to save a dying species. How were you kind of able to keep that unbiased opinion and get both sides to open up to you when it is a very it's a very emotional subject for a lot of them?
Yeah. Well, you were there for a bit of it, and so you got to see sort of the sausage being made. And in some cases, you know, it's essentially almost just like knocking on a door and asking people to talk to you. In other cases, it's constantly sort of reaching out to people. I think that, you know, one thing is that a lot of the folks in this world know my work, and so I think there thankfully is a reservoir of trust. So I think it's easier to have doors opened when people know your previous work and recognize, hopefully, that you are trying to be fair, thorough, nuanced, and, you know, tell a compelling story. So with the scientists, with the environmental advocates, with the government officials, I think that it was easier to open doors. There was some more resistance from the lobster community, although the Massachusetts Lobstermen's Association held a screening of my last film, and I went to their annual event and for Lobster War, and, you know, addressed 100 people, and it was a cool conversation, and, you know, it was a nice thing. With this film, there was more hesitancy because there's a lot of lawsuits involved, and I would say that there was only I'd probably say I interviewed 100 people or so for this film, and there's really only one group that declined to be interviewed, and those were the representatives of the Maine Lobstermen's Association. And I think they recognized that there was very little in it for them to look good through this story. But, you know, we did our best to represent their point of view by attending their rallies and by going to different meetings and interviewing as many of them who would be willing to talk to us.
And how did you go about getting these interviews? Was it a lot of pre-contact, or were there some of them that kind of came up along the way? And how did you kind of keep a shooting schedule as things were constantly flowing?
So in some cases, it was more or less luck. And in other cases, it was doing a lot of research to try to figure out who might make the best person. But in other cases, it was just following the story and figuring out what the beats of the story would be. And so for me, when I think about how to make a film, I think of it in scenes. And, you know, what would be a relevant and compelling scene? What's going to cover the bases to tell the story? And what's the through line of the story? And so in some ways for this film, it was quite easy in that when we started making this film, we had this huge group of all of the different stakeholders, the lobstermen, the scientists, the regulators, the federal and state regulators, all in one room. And if you guys have seen the film, that was the Atlantic large whale take reduction team, which Mackenzie was there for for I think both of the meetings that we attended.
Yeah.
And so it was actually a great thing because they introduced our presence. People had already, for the most part, already knew my work, and so we were able to actually sort of lay the groundwork at that meeting because they knew what we were working on, and so that opened up doors that might have been harder to open. And then, I think the biggest challenge, which you saw, was getting the primary lobsterman in the film, Rob Martin, and his wife Lori, to talk to us and agree to signing a waiver. And in that case, I had heard Rob was probably the best person to talk to for the film, or to focus on in the film, and I thought he would be a compelling person, because unlike anyone else in this saga, he's actually already, and has been for years now, been experiencing the impact of regulations to protect right whales, in that his livelihood is shut down for at least 3 months a year when whales are in Cape Cod Bay, and he and lobstermen who work in Cape Cod Bay aren't allowed to fish. And so that was the primary reason I wanted to talk to him. But I also heard he was pretty open-minded and was, interested in experimenting with different kinds of gear, like breaking strength rope that is easier to avoid entanglements in whales, and also ropeless fishing. And you were there, Mackenzie, on the first shoot with him, when you probably heard me talking on the phone with him and his wife, and they basically, we didn't know what to expect, and they basically just said, he said, I'm going to be at my boat at this time, why don't you come down? And we had no idea how that was going to go, and we just asked him if he would talk to us, and he agreed. He took me on a ride on his boat. He took us back to his house, where we saw some 800 lobster traps on his lawn, which were there because he couldn't fish. And so when that all happened, and then they sat down with us, he and his wife sat down with us for a really compelling interview, I just knew that we had the ingredients to make this a film.
And then how do you go about, through those interviews, getting sound bites and making sure that you get the most powerful quotes to use for the film?
Yeah, I mean, so again, I'm thinking in scenes and trying to tell stories with as much verite as possible, and then also interviewing principal folks in as much depth as possible. And so for me, I think it's there's an interesting distinction between interviewing people for print and for visual media, and I've learned the hard way, I think, about how to make that distinction. And it involves trying to shut your mouth as much as possible, and guide people along the way, and know the kinds of things you're looking for, or know what they really need to cover to tell their stories effectively. And sometimes it involves asking the same question multiple times and getting them to repeat themselves until they sort of say it with the right authority or sufficient clarity. And it often involves starting, in a way that doesn't come across as threatening or frightening, to allow people to open up and ease up. And I think, with the fisherman that we were just talking about, Rob Martin, it was actually a challenge. I don't know if you remember this, but cutting the footage of his interviews was hard, because he speaks with a lot of ums, and he's got this really I'm trying to find the right adjective, unique or distinct Massachusetts accent. And and clarity wasn't always there, and so we had to somewhat hunt for. He speaks over himself. He speaks in run-on sentences, and so it took a little work to find, the right bites from him that were clear and on point.
Do you have a favorite interview or favorite day of shooting? And what was it, and what was that experience like?
It's hard to say. I mean, there were a lot of really compelling moments along the way. I had this great trip, which you weren't there for, on the Ishtar, which is a I'm trying to remember the type of boat it is, a sailboat owned by Stormy Mayo, who is a scientist who works for the Center for Coastal Studies. He spent years laboring in his driveway to rebuild this schooner, I think it is. And I'd always imagined sort of going out with him, and he invited us out on Cape Cod Bay on this beautiful day. And it was just, it was just so glorious to be out there. And he's such a great guy. And it was just, the weather was just right. And so it was just this really special moment for me, at least, to be out there with him, and to sort of see things through his eyes. But of course, being out on the water with the whales, when that first shoot I did when when the whales were in Cape Cod Bay, it kind of felt like a show they were putting on for us almost. We reached a point where there were just whales breaching all over the place, like, right next to the boat. And it was like they were like, show me in action. And it was just like, it was just amazing. So that was a highlight. And then, of course, one of the moments I was waiting for to shoot as we were shooting the film was a whale that had died, and a necropsy. And when we learned about the first whale to die in the summer of 2019 by the name of Wolverine, I felt an urgency to get there, except the whale showed up dead in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and I learned 24 hours before that it was going to be taken to this tiny island off the Acadian coast. It's a really remote, difficult place to get to. And I just, made plans to go right away. I mean, within an hour of learning what was going to go, I got booked on a flight, and on multiple flights. I had to fly, I think, first to Toronto, and then to Ottawa, and then to, I think, Fredericton. I don't remember the name of the town in the middle of New Brunswick. Then I had to rent a car. I didn't arrive to New Brunswick until midnight, and then rented a car with a Globe photographer, because I was basically going on the Globe's dime and and wrote a story about this for the paper, and spent 3.5 hours driving to this beach, where we arrived just before dawn, like at 4:00 in the morning. And it was actually perfect timing. We crashed for like a half hour in the car, and we had this brilliant sunrise, and we were searching all over because we knew the whale was sort of deposited on the beach. And all of a sudden we saw this crane in the distance just as dawn broke. And it was this really powerful moment for me, because after months of working on this film, all of a sudden I was alone, aside from this Globe photographer, on this beach in this magical golden light, with the waves sort of gently, rolling onto this whale. And there was nobody else there. And it was just this really kind of sanctified, holy moment, if you will, for me, as I sort of communed with this incredibly majestic creature that was fully intact and just, unmoving right on the beach. And some of the best footage I got was that morning.
Which kind of brings us into one of the questions that a viewer said, which is, do you think the film has helped boost the conversation on right whales, and how have you kind of gotten people to watch the film?
Great question, and I hope so. We decided, because of the urgency of the story, um, and the failure of the federal government to actually take any action, despite all of these proposals to actually, reduce the number of lobster lines in the water and take other measures. Nothing has yet to happen. And so this summer, we premiered the film at the Woods Hole Film Festival, where we learned it was the most watched doc and the second most watched film of the festival. And then we entered it into the Jackson Wild Media Competition, which is this acclaimed film festival for environmental films or nature films. And we were lucky enough to win an award at Jackson Wild, and that was huge for us, because once we won that award, it gave us all kinds of it ignited all kinds of interest in the film. And since then, we've been playing at all different film festivals. All, of course, are virtual, with the exception of one, which I'll tell you about in a second. But we're at the Globe Docs Film Festival, which is a Boston Globe Film Festival. Tomorrow, we're going to be showing it at the International Ocean Film Festival in San Francisco. Last week, we showed it at the Friday Harbor Film Festival in Washington. In a week or two, we're going to be showing it at the Environmental Film Festival in the nation's capital, and so on. You can see on our website all these different festivals that we're in. We just this last weekend showed it at the Mystic Film Festival, which was an odd in-person festival, which was really strange. And I had to speak afterward, and I was wearing 3 masks. And I was like basically hyperventilating toward the end, because I could barely breathe and speak at the same time with that many masks on. But we were very excited. We won another award there, Best Conservation Film there. And we're now hosting all kinds of virtual screenings for all kinds of different groups like this. And it's a cool, intimate way of sharing the film. Normally at this time, we'd be showing it in theaters, but of course, that for the most part really isn't happening. But we've had all kinds of amazing interest in the film. Just today, yesterday and today, was this annual event called the North Atlantic Right Whale Consortium, of which like 400 or 500 people sign up, scientists, academics, all kinds of people interested in the film. And we held a screening last night, and I don't know, 100 plus people watched the film. And today I had a conversation with all of these researchers. And so it was fantastic, because these are the people who it means the most to. And I got all sorts of interest about people who wanted to share it from there. So in short, we're doing a sort of unconventional pandemic-like theatrical campaign, and now we're also talking to a range of potential distributors and broadcasters, and we've had all kinds of interest in the film, and that, we still haven't made any agreements, but we have offers on the table, and we're sort of trying to figure out what makes the most sense and how to balance them so that the film gets the best ride.
Do you think the unconventional way in which you're kind of going through film festivals and spreading the film has benefited it in any way? Or comparatively to your other films, do you think in-person screenings are more positive of an output for documentaries?
Well, I think it depends on the film. Going the festival route is the conventional route for a film. So what's unconventional is the fact that all but the Mystic Film Festival are virtual festivals, which creates all kinds of weird things. Like, traditionally, you don't put your film online until you reach that stage in the film. You're very guarded about how you share your film and who you share your film with. and so we sort of broke those rules by essentially sharing the film digitally with people selectively. But these festivals are weird because usually you have like, you can control it. So there's like, 100, 150 people might show up at a theater, and it's a very specific, isolated event. Whereas these virtual festivals are for like a week, and they'll ask to keep your film online, and all these weird sort of things that are things that, as a filmmaker, when you want to protect your content and not have it be overexposed, you're kind of a little reluctant to do. So we've kind of had to balance that, and we've had to tell people they could only show it for a certain period of time and that kind of thing. But I do think that one of the nice things about this is normally when we do the theatrical campaigns for other films, it would require me traveling a lot, like driving 6 hours to like some place in Maine to a theater to show the film, and that would be taxing and tiring, and I have 2 little kids, and so it's kind of nice to be able to sit in my place and have these kinds of conversations, and in some ways it's cooler because you're reaching more people potentially. We'll see. It's still a work in progress, but I think these kinds of settings would have been unlikely, and now they're conventional and accepted, and I expect they'll probably be more so in the future. I think this will just be a part of the way people share films in the future.
Absolutely. Do you see yourself expanding further on the trilogy in the coming years?
I don't know what my next project is. There had been people talking to me about making a shark film or writing a shark book, but I don't know. It feels like that space has been kind of done. So I'm not really enthralled with that idea yet. But there is probably a compelling story in that, if I could find a unique angle that isn't super lurid or Jaws like to keep people sucked in. Right now we're just trying to survive the pandemic, and my main focus has been trying to bring this film into the world, and now we're sort of it almost feels like we're reaching the glide path for it to be set free and on its own, and so once we've kind of given enough wind to the sails for this film, then I can think about what the next project is.
And then finally, I'm just going to go through the final questions that we have from our viewers. What made you get into journalism in the first place, and was it something you've always been interested in since you were young?
So the answer is no. It wasn't something I was necessarily interested in from when I was young. I think I first wanted to be an airplane, and when I realized I couldn't be an inanimate object, I started to expand my horizons. But I think I wrote a bit for my college newspaper, but it was more like essays and over-the-top essays than actual journalism. And there were a couple moments that I would say sort of steered me in the direction of wanting to be a journalist. One was when I left college, where I studied philosophy and political science at the University of Michigan. I moved to Ann Arbor. I moved to San Francisco, drove across the country right after college, where I spent a lot of my time on the poetry circuit and sort of giving poetry readings for over-the-top poetry I was writing at the time. And during that year, I read this book by Milan Kundera called Immortality. And there was this passage in that book, there was a chapter called The 11th Commandment. And the idea of the 11th commandment was that in a place like the United States, where journalists are sort of given this rarefied perch to ask people questions, and people are expected to answer them, the 11th commandment was, thou shalt answer the journalist's question. And that to me sort of gave me this sense that this would be a really fascinating way to learn about the world and to enter people's lives and to be able to ask people any question you could think of, hard questions, deep questions, intimate questions, without necessarily. So there was that. And then around that time, I was invited to this speech that this guy, this ultra nationalist from Russia, who many people thought was going to become the next leader in Russia, this super anti-Semitic zealot, came to speak in San Francisco. And I went, and at the end there was a Q&A session, and this guy with shaggy hair and a kind of tweed rumpled jacket and elbow patches got up to the microphone and just asked these really, these really to the point, hard-hitting questions. And I just saw this guy and I thought, I want to be like that guy. I think I could do that. And so I applied to journalism school, and I went to Northwestern, and my first job was through Northwestern in Mexico City. I spent a semester as a foreign correspondent in Washington, D.C., where you get assigned when you're a student to work for a specific paper. And I got assigned to work for this paper in Mexico City. And then they offered me a job afterwards. So I ended up moving to Mexico City. And I took a job actually at another paper, which seemed to be a little bit more independent. And that was my first job.
What advice do you have for young journalists who are looking to report or make documentaries post-college?
So you have a number of things going for you that were harder when I was starting out. And then there are things that aren't as easy. So I'd say the first thing is be brave. If you can, do exactly what you want, that compels you, that you feel like is something that is a burning desire that you want to do more than anything else. And for me, telling stories and having those stories touch people and hopefully affect public policy and have an impact in the world are the things that really motivate me. And so when I say you have luck, you have tools now that have democratized filmmaking specifically. For a relatively small price, you can buy a camera that is capable of really being enough to make a serious film with. You have access to these sweeping, incredibly cinematic images, sweeping images from drones that would have been impossible when I was starting. And you have this incredible program that you guys were all part of, where you're learning actually how to use all of this stuff. And so I think you guys have the skills that I lacked, and in some cases still lack, about understanding how to edit, how to shoot, how to use sound. And so you have the building blocks, and you just need to have the courage to launch on a project and find partners who can help guide you and work with you to refine your skills and your storytelling. So there's that, and whether it's print or whether it's on film.
Where can people go after this Zoom call to kind of view your other work and read some of your articles that you've written about the North Atlantic right whale?
Sure. So, so you can see a lot more about the whale on our website, entangled-film.com. And so, so you can see a bunch of stories I've written. We have a page. I just updated that yesterday with the news about the decline in the right whales. Thank you for posting that in the chat section. And you can see more about you can see the trailers to all of my films on my website, which is davidabel.com. And someone could put that in the chat too. I can write it, ABEL. I can do it. There you go.
Oh, there we go.
Does anyone else have any questions? Anything specific anyone wants to ask?
Let's see.
I'll add my email address. And Twitter handle, which is always a good way to find me. There. So if you guys have more questions, feel free to reach out to me. I'm happy.
Oh, we actually just got a new one.
Okay.
Do you have any advice for networking in this field of work?
So I think, and I assume the question is about documentary films. Is that correct?
Yes.
I think the answer is, I think going to film festivals is one way, and obviously in person that's hard now. But film festivals often offer a really great intimate way to meet filmmakers and to meet all kinds of people. That actually Twitter handle's wrong. Thank you, whoever added that. DAVABEL, right? So I think there are probably meetings. I don't really know, like if there are Facebook groups, the Emerson. I mean, I think what you're all doing right now is a kind of networking, being in school, if you were actually in school, but you have all these relationships that you're building, and hopefully you've gotten to know people who might be your colleagues in the future, and working with peers and being open to, unexpected relationships is huge. I mean, for me, having, the serendipity of meeting a former student of mine years later who became my chief partner in making films was huge and totally unexpected, and great for me because I've learned so much from him, and I feel like we've done a lot of great work together. So
it's the beauty of the Emerson Mafia.
It is, yes.
Okay, our final question before I let you kind of say anything you felt like you want to share is, what is the best way to market your documentary and bring change into society?
I mean, the truth is I'm still trying to figure out the answer to both of those questions. But everything I've discussed so far are the steps to try to have your film make an impact. There are people who are paid for a living to actually do that. They're called impact producers, and they're basically skilled in marketing your film and sharing your film. But it's trying to sort of build the building blocks. It's getting people behind your film in the beginning, which involves sometimes finding people who can help you make the film, finding funders, building a network of people who, as you make the film, might be cheerleading your project. There's people who do crowdfunding, not even just to raise money, but to get to have people
get skin in the game. So even if people like give you $5 for your project, you're basically getting an email address, and you could give people updates along the way. But then, building your websites and your multimedia, your social media accounts to try to share the word, and then finding places who will feature your film and winning awards. And all of these things are sort of the ingredients or building blocks that will help you get the film to be shared with ever wider audiences. And we're in the middle of that right now. And I'm glad to say, we have now a national broadcaster interested in the film, and other international distributors. And so we haven't, those aren't done deals, so we don't know what's going to happen, but those are just the ways we're using to try to get the film shared with the widest audience possible. So that's the goal.
Well, thank you so much for your time, and congratulations on the success of the film. Is there anything you'd like to share with our viewers before we end the Q&A session?
Well, I just say a couple things. Number one, thank you, Mackenzie, for organizing this. Thank you, Mackenzie, for taking part and being an early believer in the film. And thank you for all of your help in the film. So everybody should give a bit of applause to Mackenzie. So I want you to know how much I appreciate that, and I'm deeply grateful for all your help. And I also want to say thank you to Emerson, because Emerson played a significant role in helping this film as well. They provided cameras to you and to Julia, and sound equipment on occasion. And so they helped us sort of get off the helped us to fledge in some ways when we were just starting. So I'm grateful for that. So thank you for organizing this. Again, for everybody listening, feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions.